the Mongols, and I am so excited about it. So today we are moving on to one of my favorite topic points in the entirety of the AP World Curriculum, and it is Mongol Empire and the making of the modern world. So the essential questions we have for you today is, to what extent did the Mongols shape the modern world? It is as simple as that. And there's a lot of things you can say on this, so you better not short me on answers today or this week, okay? And the last one, and the next one, is identify and explain why the Mongols were able to conquer and manage the largest land empire in history. So two-part questions here, and so make sure you're answering and responding to in Canvas. So moving on, the context. So it's the 12th century. We've been in the same time period for a while now. The Mongols were a disunited clan of pastoral nomads surrounded by a pastoral tribe such as the Tartars. So, on the Asian steppe, you have lots of different little clans that are practicing a pastoralist lifestyle. So they're raising and breeding livestock such as sheep, cattle, but horses especially as well. So, and as a result, they are becoming master at herding these animals. They are the masters of horse riding. The horses that they ride into battle and such are some of the more powerful ones. I know there's multiple like breeds of horses. For them, they had the big, strong ones. The Chinese had little tiny, not tiny, but they had ones that were not like what the Mongols were riding. And so Mongol leader Genghis Khan, as he's often pronounced as well, most commonly in the West, we call him Genghis Khan. But he was born a man or boy, his name was Temujin, eventually becomes the great Khan, Genghis Khan, and he would end up uniting all of these pastoral tribes to lead to the creation of the largest geographical empire in history. It's continuous empire, I guess would be a better way of putting it. But the language of the curriculum: empires collapsed in different regions of the world, and some areas were replaced with new imperial states, including the Mongol Khanates. So let's talk about this. So Genghis Khan, Temujin, same person all around and such. He's going to do a lot of things that kind of create this tribal unity. And so he creates these alliances with defeated neighbors and neighboring groups as they kind of fought each other on the Asian steppes. One would kind of incorporate the other. He did so in different ways. One way that he did kind of create some uniting these tribes under the kind of the Mongols and such. He would marry the oldest son and daughter of the neighboring Khan. So, creating this blood unity would be able to kind of hopefully end the fighting, which families fight still. But regardless, having blood relations with each other, that certainly helps kind of unite them together, especially in these pastoral communities and so forth. He would also appointed very talented non-family members to the heads of positions. And so he created this merit-based system where he would hire or put people in positions of power that were more capable, other than just like picking a family member and putting them in that position. And then he also would really require personal loyalty to him in a way that helped better run his kingdom. So, he's looking for people who are good at the jobs. He's also looking for people who are loyal and do what he wants as far as managing his empire. And so this is something of reasons for why he was able to not only conquer, but manage this land more so. And when he says appointed talented non-family members, it doesn't just stop at his rival pastoralist tribes that he incorporates. It's also the people he conquers. So he don't care if you're Persian or Mandarin Chinese or San Chinese, whatever it is. If you're good at what you do, he's going to put you in that position, and then he's going to require you to be loyal. Okay, he was an extremely ruthless leader at the same time. So we kind of have the carrot, and then you also have the stick side. He was elected as the Khan by the Mongols to a Kruotai, which was this way of gathering together, and they would all ride together, and then they would vote with the horses' hooves and such. Something that kind of is described in the thought bubble of the crash course video that I have linked to this assignment as well. So not a required watch, but if you are interested in learning more about the Mongols, every one of those videos kind of give you some more information. So I encourage you all to watch it if you are interested in this stuff as I am. So he took the name Genghis Khan, even though he was born Temujin. He took the name Genghis Khan because the meaning of the word is the ruler of all. Khan is kind of like a term like king, right? So he is Genghis, he's Khan, so the ruler of all. That's kind of what ends up his name that will carry through history. So I mentioned he's an extremely ruthless leader and ruthless conqueror, especially. And anybody who resisted the Mongols and tried to fight against them or stood up to them in any way, he would punish them, severely. He would destroy entire populations of cities and towns. And the brutality of these conquests were just as effective as the conquests themselves in gaining more territory. And imagine you are, during the conquest of these, like the brutality of them, some people were left alive so that they can send them in the direction of where they want to go next. So imagine you have experienced and seen the slaughter take place in your town or city, whatever, and such, and you're basically, you're allowed to go and get refuge. You show up to that town and say, you don't want to stand up to them. They will find a way to destroy you. Surrender when they come here. Just do what they say. It's better than dying the way that my town or city has been wiped from the face of the earth. And so it was a very effective way of conquering, because you save yourself some time and grief in trying to conquer yourself. So by doing this whole very, very destructive way of destroying entire towns practically, you also make it easier for your armies moving forward. A great story, and whether it's true or not, is something of like when Genghis Khan encountered this town, and at first they resisted to capitulating to him. And so he's like, all right, well, I'll leave if you give me all of the songbirds that you have in your town, because I guess it's something they had there, and pay that to me in tribute, and I will leave. And so they're like, all right, we'll do that. And so they gave them all. And these are like pet birds that knew how to fly home and where to go and such. And so what he did was they tied paper and flammable material to the feet of these birds. And then, while they were all sitting in cages, he had one of his men just take a torch and light all this paper and then open the cage, and all of them fly back to this town that they were from, because that was their instinct, especially when they're on fire, go to safety, right? And what it did was basically set the entire town on fire. Really creative on conquest and destruction, but terrible. And you hear stories about this, then you definitely have to respect the Mongols as a conquering people. So the Khanates or kingdoms, so king, Khan, Khanate, kingdom, right? So Khanates would then have spread from the North China Sea all the way to the Persia by 1227. And you can kind of see the spread of this. It's a great empire, and when you compare it to like the size of all these other empires that are around, this is something that because, and even though this land is largely uninhabitable, they still had control over it. And think about what else they have control over when we're talking about this area, and we've already talked about it with 2.1, and that's the Silk Roads. So the Mongols war, the soldiers were extremely strong riders, and I mentioned that before because of first of all, they're born on the Asian steppe, and you got to be tough as nails to survive in that environment to begin with. It's very hot, dry, and it's extremely cold in the wintertime. So we're talking about environmentally, they've already been put through something that's kind of toughened them up to begin with. They're very strong riders. They're very skilled with short bows. Being kind of hunting was a part of their culture. They can translate that to being a soldier at the same time. And they were so good at riding that they could, in fact, direct their horses with just the power of their legs. Typically you have the riding, you're holding on to a piece of leather that's tied to the teeth of the horse, and you pull them and such. To be able to use your legs to move them frees up your hands, and then they would just either use a sword or a bow and arrow and just ride around these armies or ride alongside these armies that they're attacking and just boom, boom, and just take them out. So very effective. Highly disciplined army. They had a clear command structure, and even in the midst of battles, they had ways to communicate with parts of their army that were on the other side of the battlefield using smoke signals and other things. And so they were extremely disciplined in their attacks, so that not to have one part of the army go off course with the battle plan or not follow the orders in the midst of battle. So they're extremely disciplined, and so their commanders, would be able to, better position them in for victory during the midst of battle. And that efficient command structure extended beyond the battlefield. It's also everything that went behind it. A great logistics system where they have army or trains of oxen-led wagons that would bring food and I won't say munitions, but food and weapons into battle to help keep the army strong and prepared. There was even a postal system that were created by horseback that extended the entirety of the empire. So if you had one part of your empire under attack or one rebellion, you can bring the bulk of your armies fairly quickly to that place because of the effectiveness and how effective this postal system was. If you've ever heard of the Pony Express, think of like the medieval version of the Pony Express. That's essentially what it was. So they used surprise tactics all the time. They would pretend to retreat and, like send a quarter of your army into, the spearhead of the battle and such. And then they would pretend like, oh no, things are going bad, run away, just like they do in Monty Python. And then they would retreat back, across the horizon to where the bulk of the army was. And so at that point, they can take the rest of the army and surround them in what we call a pincer move. So basically surround them. And then once they get them encircled, all they have to do is spend days picking them off with bows and arrows, harassing them, the killing could go on for days and weeks because they had trapped them and there's no way out. They would send small groups to see if they would surrender. And I've talked about this. If they refused to surrender, then they would kill all the leaders and the skilled workers, to kind of send a message, especially the wealthy people in the town. They would the others that were left behind would be used as laborers. And then if you were a scribe or scholar or somebody of significant education of some kind, the Mongols kept you alive because they could use you. They could use you in helping manage their empire, after you conquer them. So that's something that they were very good in terms of not just when they conquer, but how they maintain control over these areas. They won for the people who were, very bright, knew how to manage the people that they had just conquered, and they kept them alive and used them to their advantage. They incorporated a lot of the technology from other civilizations as they conquered them. An example of that was like the siege weaponry, the catapult, the trebuchet. It's right here. It's a type of catapult. Something that they took from the opposites, the armies of the Muslim countries in the Middle East. And they saw how effective that was, and they just incorporated it as part of theirs. And I was like, yeah, well, this is one way we can, take down walls and get our armies into, because walls are not very good when it comes to cavalry and horseback soldiers. But if you can take them down, then, and using these incorporated technologies, then it opens up and such. There's even a story where they would catapult the cadavers of people who died from the plague into the cities to help spread disease into those cities. And whether or not that was effective or not is debatable. But regardless, it's kind of cool to think that they were kind of thinking biological warfare already. So the Mongol Empire, I got something in my eye. The Mongol Empire continued to expand after the death of Genghis Khan. And three of his grandsons would end up setting their own kind of khanates that would continue to conquer parts of Middle East, China, Eastern Europe, as far as Eastern Europe. These are things that happen in kind of more modern day Russia as well. So we're going to talk about three of them. We're going to talk about the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, and the Great Khanate. So let's start with Batu and the Golden Horde. this is if you see, this is the Golden Horde right here. They're going to conquer parts of what is now modern day Russia and what was kind of the Russian kingdoms that existed there. And even though we didn't talk about where Russia comes from, a lot of there's links to the Vikings, who sailed down the rivers into kind of the Eastern Central Europe, not Central Europe, but Eastern Europe part that kind of becomes Russia, and established these city states, that end up becoming kind of the beginnings of Russia. One of the city-state, Moscovia, is going to Moscow. Will eventually become like the dominant city-state that will eventually take control over a lot of them, and the large part is because of the conquest of the Mongols. So the capital city of the Russian, was Kiev, which is in modern-day Ukraine. And so as they're conquering West, they tried to fight against the Mongols and such. It did not work. Almost never does. But they pretty much destroyed Kiev and kind of opened the door to where other city-states come into play, Moscow being the big one, right? Now, the the Golden Horde and the Mongols really kind of lose interest in trying to conquer Western Europe. They get to the doorsteps of Europe in Vienna, Austria, where they're defeated, surprisingly. But by that point, their logistic trains, be able to get them supplies in a timely manner, had just been stretched so thin that they were pretty much worried that they could not sustain that conquest westward into Western Europe. So for the Europeans, largely Western Europeans, they were spared the attacks and the conquests of the Mongols. And so that's something that's worth noting, because history would have been very, very different had they been able to continue. So the rulers of Moscow, rather than resisting against the Russia or the Mongols like Kiev did, they basically play the middleman. It's like, hey, we're here to help you. We will collect the taxes and the tribute that you want from us, and we'll give them to you. So we'll make sure we take that money and collect it from all these city states, and we'll get it to you. And so they kind of work with the Mongols in that sense. But at the same time, they were kind of skimming money off of those tributes and taxes and storing it for their own kind of rainy day fund, or a day where they could use that money to build their own army that could eventually fight the Mongols off, which is what happens. So by the mid-16th century, the remaining Mongol descendants were defeated by these kind of Russian city-states, Moscow especially. The only exception to that were the Crimean Tatars, which is a kind of clan within the Mongols themselves. And the Crimea is this area that is kind of a peninsula on the top north of the Black Sea, which is a very kind of resource-rich / a beautiful place. So it's highly desired. But they were able to kind of encamp there and stay there for another extended period of time. I don't remember exactly when, but I'm thinking into the 1800s that they held control of that territory. So as a result, this, the Mongol conquest set it up to where it establishes what Russia is today, where Moscow is the base of the Russian Empire's power. Russia today, Moscow is still the capital and so forth. But that is, not possible without the Mongols and their conquests. Telugu and the Islamic heartlands, the Ilkhanate is a better way of putting it. So the Mongols also are going to be responsible for conquering the Abbasid Empire, or the Abbasid dynasty, and their territories by 1258. The capital of the Abbasid was the city of Baghdad, which was one of the largest and most glamorous cities in the world. We've talked about Baghdad before, and if you recall, what was in Baghdad that was kind of the major center point of the Islamic scholarship and academic studies? It was the House of Wisdom. And on top of the House of Wisdom, there were like 28 other libraries that were in Baghdad. So when the Mongols arrive, and it was surrounded by city walls and so forth, eventually they get themselves in and they just wreck Baghdad. They destroy all of the libraries. They destroy the House of Wisdom. They killed the Caliph, who was the religious leader of all of Islam, but also kind of the state's leader of the Abbasid, what was left of the Abbasid dynasty, who had been gradually losing power to places like the Mamluks and in Egypt, the Seljuk Turks, kind of Central Europe, Central Asia. They had been losing power. So this was the nail in the coffin for the Abbasids. They stopped in 1260 by an alliance. So the conquest continued, beyond the Abbasids. They were stopped in 1260 by the Abbasid, kind of remains of the Abbasid Empire, but mostly by the Muslim Mamluks and Crusaders in Palestine, who had been fighting against each other for some time, but they kind of laid down their arms against each other to focus on the threat of the Mongols, and were able to defeat them. And so their conquest kind of came to a stopping point, similar to what happens with the Golden Horde in the defeat at Austria. So once they kind of settle this region, over time, like the cultural interactions between the Mongols as well as the people who live there, who are all Muslim typically, which is certainly the dominant religion. I don't want to say that all of them were, but it's the dominant religion. Many of the Mongols end up converting to to Islam itself, and when they did, they kind of end the Mongol tradition of Islamic, or not Islamic, but religious tolerance, as well as Islamic religious tolerance as well. When we talked about this before, in the territories that were controlled by Islam, the people who practice Christianity and Judaism, who also are living in this region as well, they in the past have been allowed to continue to do so as long as they pay that tax, the jizya. And so when the Mongols convert and such, they end that practice, and basically it's either convert or die in some cases. And so large amounts of people who are Jewish and Christians were killed in the Ilkhanate if they did not convert to Islam. So that's something worth in noting. Such, a lot of people talk about the persecution of Jews being just the Holocaust. There's a long history here. Here's another example of what happens as a result of being a minority religion in typically areas that have a supermajority of either Christians or Islamic areas. So the most important, and I think the one that's worth noting the most, is Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty. So Song dynasty is going to, have a good run. And we've talked about Song and all the things that they had there. The conquest of China is going to take some time, somewhere between 1235 to 1271. Does it take, all day. Does it take for them to be able to conquer and such? And so just like anywhere else, like you resist, they wreck the town, they wreck the cities, they, destroy tons of them, right? Kill lots of inhabitants, pick the ones they, are good at stuff and keep them and use them as a way to kind of rule over. I'm train of thought here. Mongols destroy cities like Chengdu and called it Dadu. It is kind of basically the beginnings of Beijing, as it is Beijing today. They instituted policies of religious tolerance, unlike the Ilkhanate, where we talked about the Ilkhanate, where they basically Islam or else. They promoted religious tolerance. So you could be a Buddhist, you can be a Confucius, you can be a Taoist, you can be a Christian, some Muslim. They really didn't really care what your religion was, and that's something that's really unique about, like, as far as conquerors go, is that they didn't expect people to convert to a religion. The religion of the Mongols themselves was shamanism. There's a story, and one that if you ever have a chance to read a good book about the Mongols, it's called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Hey, that sounds like this unit or this topic. But in that book, he kind of talks about where there was this I wouldn't call it a show or a theater, but a meeting of all of these, very prestigious people in religions, priests, shamans, so forth, where they had this religious debate on which religion is the true religion. And so, this is like a party in the same sense. So, like, people are drinking, they're just enjoying hearing this argument and such. At some point, like so much has been drunk and it's time to go to bed. And Genghis Khan, I think it's Genghis, it might have been one of his grandsons, he just basically says, it doesn't really, your religion works for you, my religion works for me. And so it's kind of like a good story to show like the beliefs of the Mongols, why themselves practice shamanism and believe that to be the best for them. They were very tolerant of other people's belief systems and allowed them to kind of universally choose whatever religion they wanted. And so this idea of religious toleration was kind of modern and forward thinking in the world that Genghis Khan and his grandsons are living in. One of the cool things about them, they're just a little bit ahead of their time. So most Chinese, they prospered during the rule of the Yuan dynasty, where Kublai Khan, he brought in people who were good at stuff. And because I mentioned, like, it doesn't matter where you came from, if you were good at something, then that was something that they wanted you to do. So an example of that would be the Persians were really good at government administration jobs. Chinese, and we talked about the Confucius system or the bureaucracy and the tests they had to take to get into bureaucracy, the imperial bureaucratic stuff. Even with all of that, the corruption was very common. And it happens quite often at the end of dynasties. But corruption in government officials was very common and towards the end of the Song dynasty. Seeing this, they saw like an opportunity to try to correct this. And so they end up, even though they rule over it, they brought Persians in who were extremely good at administrating and helped administrate the government of the Yuan dynasty. And so they did that. They improved foreign trade. I mean, they protected the Silk Road trade like nobody before, even though they destroyed it. They came back and they built it up to something that was, at the height of the Silk Road, because you could travel from one end of the Silk Road to the other, and you would have just this kind of golden plate that marks that you are protected. Nobody's going to mess with you, because if they do, guess what happens? There's going to be a Mongol horde that's going to be coming to end your life. Mongol women during this time were like more highly independent and held in higher regards in society than most in their time. And when you compare that to what we were talking about with Song Dynasty back in topic 1.1 in the very beginning of the year, remember, what was the common practice, especially amongst like the elite members of the Song Dynasty? Foot binding. And so that foot binding, was seen as kind of barbaric by the Mongols and so forth. And they didn't see, because like they live in a more egalitarian society, as pastoralists relied on everyone pulling their weight and so forth. Women were often viewed more in higher regard in society than, in Song Dynasty. So this is the kind of, layout of our topics in a little bit, but kind of to extend a little bit more so in our next stuff. It's a society developed, as societies develop, they are affected by the ways they produce, exchange, and consume goods. So this is kind of more added on with the Mongols and kind of the effect they have as their conquest. The expansion of the empire, including the Mongols, facilitated Afro-Eurasian trade and communication to new peoples, and were drawn to their conquerors' economies and trade networks. So let's talk about them in a little more detail, okay? So Mongols and peace. The Mongols, as ruthless as conquerors as they were very effective in peace times as well. After they conquered this large area, this kind of sets up during the 13th, 14th century as an era we call Pax Mongolica. It is basically referring to, it's Latin for Mongol peace. There's a Pax Romana, which is Roman peace, but this is Pax Mongolica. So, I mentioned before, they would consult Chinese and Islamic scholars and engineers to kind of best serve what they could do in terms of solving issues. Despite destroying these cities, they rebuilt them better than ever. They built possibly more bridges than any other empire in history. And we're talking about a great vast area where you cross the Asian steppes, you have lots of like little rivers and creeks, ways and such to make the travel easier and more convenient. They built more bridges to do so. Religious toleration throughout the empire, with the exception of the Alkani. And then Mongol soldiers would focus on protecting trade and allowing merchants to continue to trade more so. And the Silk Road was more active under the Mongols than it had been at any point in history. So it's really ironic how like they destroyed it and then built it up to become better. And that was something the Mongols did. So the development of ideas and beliefs in religions illustrate how groups in societies view themselves, and the interactions with societies and their beliefs often have political, social, and cultural implications. So that's kind of like your cultural development and interaction overview stuff. But as far as relating to this topic area, interregional contacts and conflicts between states and empires, including the Mongols, encouraged significant technological and cultural transfers. Okay, so long-term impacts. All right, long-term impacts of the Mongol conquest, and these are just some. There's a lot more we could talk about, but I don't want to overwhelm you. And if you are interested, I've linked in and with our assignment some experts from that book. I mentioned the Genghis Khan, The Making of the Modern World. It has a lot more examples in there, but one thing, it conquered the largest land empire in history. That's bound to have like long-term impacts in a lot of ways. They revitalized the interregional trade between Eurasia and Europe and Asia. So through the Silk Roads and so forth. Interregional cultural exchanges, Islamic scientific knowledge finds its way into China. So they the stuff that we've talked about as far as the attributes to technology and advancements made in Islam are going to find its way into China. Chinese paper ends up becoming a major influencer. It's spread throughout the Islam and then further west to Europe. This kind of led to what eventually becomes the Gutenberg press, which is the kind of the credit of the first printing press, even though woodblock printing had already been done by the Chinese. Transfer of Greco-Islamic medical knowledge we've talked about back in topic 1.2, and that transfers throughout the empire. The Arabic numbering system also, because of the Mongol conquest, finds its way more so into Western Europe. So these are things that the Mongols, if they didn't happen, as many millions of people that they killed in their conquest, this didn't happen without those conquests. Okay. The military conquest also helped transmit fleas that carried the bubonic plague, which has huge demographic consequences in Europe and in East Asia. The successful rule because of a centralized power, they had a very clear structure to help manage their land. And again, they have a merit-based system. They choose who's good at what and put them in those positions. Some would also say this was the end of knights in armor and walled cities because the Mongols found a way in. The knights in armor and such, like their armor, as thick as it was and such, was no match for the bows and arrows that the Mongols would carry. And so if you got wounded with one of these arrows, it'd be very difficult for you to be able to remove that bow or that arrow, causing sepsis of the blood for people to die. So the knights, not to mention, it's very heavy and burdensome. The Mongols were all about speed, and that was something that they played a big role in their conquest. Walled cities, no longer they're going to go the way of the dodo, not only because of the use of siege weaponry like the trebuchet, but some would consider that the Mongols were kind of responsible for the invention of the cannon. And so what they had done is kind of been able to kind of move people around in the empire. You took bell makers from Eastern Europe. You took mathematicians from Islam. You took alchemists from China. Put them all together to create the idea of gunpowder and then, building the cannon. So some consider that the cannon is a Mongol invention. And it's more or less that they've created this environment where these different peoples from different areas could have these cultural exchanges that would lead to the creation of the cannon. And once the cannon's around, it's really no point to building a wall anymore. It takes several days for you to like knock down a wall, depending on the wall, if you have enough cannons to do so, which is why Constantinople eventually falls in 1453, which we'll talk about that another time. Transfer of Greco-Islamic medical culture or medical knowledge to Western Europe, I mentioned. The transferring the number system, I mentioned here. Also, the adoption of the Uyghur script, which was very common in Yuan Dynasty. These are examples that are given by College Board, but I just don't know how much more I'd talk about them as far as the cultural impacts itself. So that's the Mongols. I'm sure you're probably looking at the time and say, wow, he talked a lot about that. Well, yes, I did, because they're really important. And when you have a title of a unit that says Mongols and the making of the modern world and a modern world history, it's important to talk about them. So make sure you answer the essential questions and resubmit them on Canvas. There's an assignment that's linked with this topic point where I'm going to ask you to evaluate some information and make a decision. How should we in history judge the Mongols? Are they a civilized group of people that play a significant role in history? Or are they barbarians that also play a role in history as well? So that's something we're going to do in discussion board on Canvas. And you have that assignment linked on Canvas, so make sure that you get started on that after you watch this video, and we will be working on that in class, and then something that you probably need to finish up at home as well. So without that being said, if you have any more questions of the Mongols, I'd be happy to answer them for you, but this is going to be it. So I will see you next time, where we'll talk about two more of the we'll talk about the other trade routes part of this unit, the Trans-Saharan, and then the Indian Ocean Trade Network. So I'll see you then.